Welcome to the Psychedelic Passage podcast. My name is Jimmy Nguyen, one of the co-founders of Psychedelic Passage, and I will be your host today. Thanks for joining us on another podcast episode. We have a really wonderful guest here on the show today, somebody who I've come into relationship more over the past few years. We have Sean McAllister. And to share a little bit about Sean is an attorney specializing in regulatory healthcare, business and religious freedom aspects of psychedelic medicines and therapies, including ketamine. His work in the past has included, advising doctors, therapists, licensed professionals on psychedelic assisted therapy, advising clients looking to obtain, religious exemptions for psychedelic use. A couple other things on Sean's past projects is he was a drafter of Colorado's Proposition 122, the Natural Medicine Health Act, has been a part of the Denver psilocybin mushroom policy review panel, general counsel for an organization that I'm a part of and love very dearly, Zendo Project, on the board of directors for Shakruna Institute, and a number of other things. So Sean practices law in Colorado, California. And, before we hear a little bit from Sean, I'll just, disclaim that nothing in this episode represents, legal advice here. And really, this is probably more of a conversation about psychedelic interested humans who are coming together, trying to figure out how this all looks here over the next period of time. So welcome, Sean. It's really great to have you here on the show.
Hey, Jimmy Nguyen, thank you for having me. The question to Jimmy Nguyen is right now. That's when. Sorry. Cheesy joke.
Jimmy Nguyen right now. Yeah, actually on my SoundCloud, I have Jimmy Nguyen, WHEN question mark.
Nice.
And the answer in all of my psychedelic discovery tends to be a lot about right now and being here right now. So I'm super grateful to be here with you now, Sean. And one of the things that we really try to do on this podcast is to have meaningful dialogue and conversations that maybe aren't always in the public sphere. And I think that one of the interesting pieces, you just seem like a busy individual. So I give you a lot of kudos for how busy you stay seemingly. And one of the things that we chatted about, before this episode was really thinking about how we as a collective can bring psychedelics into this society here in the United States, the social fabric, the cultural fabric, and then of course, like the regulatory fabric, the community fabric. What does that look like, and how we can bring psychedelics into the public sphere in a really, meaningful way? And one of the things that really struck me was, when you were saying that you live at the intersection of a lot of the different ways that people engage with legal psychedelics. So I wonder if you could just start by, sharing a little bit so that the audience can get to know you, if you want to spend a little time talking about what got you here to this right now moment.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. So nice to be here. And I hope everyone gets a lot of value out of this time we spend together. Because I guess that is the base of everything I do. And I know where you come from is a spiritual commitment when we pray every day to the relief of pain and suffering of all sentient beings. What does that mean? That means that your efforts hopefully will do something other than just help yourself. So who am I? I am a guy that's in recovery from Western culture, in recovery from being male, in recovery from being a lawyer for 25 years. But also, while parts of me have died and withered over time, there's others that are expanding. And so where we are as a culture is, we are the country that founded the war on drugs in the mid 1900s. And it was memorialized in law in 1970 in the Controlled Substances Act. And there were many things before that criminalized psychedelics and drugs in general. And so we're the same country that founded this war on drugs, but now we're the country that's dismantling it. We're the country with the most decriminalized environment for cannabis and psychedelics of any country in the world. The country that was the perpetrator of so many misdeeds around, control.
Mm-hmm.
And you think about these laws that were passed in 1970, most of them were passed by predominantly white men born in 1900 or 1910. So we were literally
Mm.
dealing with 18th century, 19th century ignorance in these laws. And we've been all part of this intergenerational transformation from a war on drugs to a treatment, more public health approach to drugs and personal freedom, too. I mean, that's part of our American heritage is this individual liberty. And so I just feel so blessed to be a small contributor to this intergenerational struggle as some of our mentors and elders in the community. I'm thinking of the founder of DPA, Ethan Nadelman, would say that, yeah, this is an intergenerational struggle. It's been going on for decades. We're 70, 60, 70 years into this war on drugs. And all of a sudden, we're creating opportunity for decriminalized psychedelics and legalized cannabis and home grow of psychedelics in Colorado and burgeoning FDA ability to use drugs for pharmaceuticals. So as you said about intersectionality, like I have just been this guy that has been purpose driven and intentionally sought to be in the intersection of law and policy and drug policy and social justice and environmentalism and art and human rights. And it feels really good. And it feels that way because of other community members like you and because of our community that we're both a part of. This is the new paradigm. This is the new era. I was thinking today about we're in this new era where there's so many beautiful flowers, but we're planted in a dead dirt of the past, And how big can we grow this garden? Can we grow the garden big enough to save the planet? Can we grow it big enough to save ourselves? So yeah, it's true. I'm blessed to be part of these many threads of issues that converge in psychedelics, and I think it's a beautiful time. As much as it's the worst time, it's the best time ever, and I'm very excited and also scared to death of the future.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm constantly thinking in my mind about this almost this 50-50 coin flip. I'm constantly thinking about, okay, are psychedelics going to be this potential tool and mechanism to allow us to like rewrite a lot of the ways that we function as a society, or will it be a tool that reinforces the same way that we function, as society? And I really appreciate some of the things that you were, touching on as far as your interest in a lot of things. And I'll add some background for our listeners that you were telling me that you started off your career in law with environmental law. And then back in 1996, California decriminalizes cannabis. And that was like a real like awakening moment for you as far as like, wow, okay, like drug policy can actually be reformed. And then to add that into your real dedication to social justice. I think you were sharing, you spent about 5 years in environmental law and then 10 years as, a criminal defense lawyer. And I can't help but think about how there's a lot of the legacy of what we're learning with cannabis and how that, relates to now. And it's pretty funny because this is an example of how what you were saying at the end, I'm both really excited and also terrified, because whenever we get to a place where um the spirit of the community and the population gets to hopefully dictate how folks engage with psychedelics and whatnot, I think that cannabis can actually be a really good cautionary tale as it relates to that being like a precursor to how psychedelics come into our society. And so thanks for being here. Just really excited to jump into, a conversation, with you today. And I would just like to start with with getting a sense on what matters to you, I think right now in the psychedelic space. I could tell that you got, like we were saying before, you sit at this place where you get to talk to a lot of different folks who kind of view psychedelics from a lot of different lenses. And I'm curious, like, what's gotten your attention, what's gotten your passion, like what's gotten your mind like thinking about things.
Well, yeah, I want to bridge this back to what you were talking about a minute or two ago, which is the lessons from cannabis. And what I'm most interested in psychedelics is cannabis is obviously very different. And as you said, I had my first sacred relationship growing cannabis in the late 90s, growing some mushrooms as well. It was a special experience for me. But, we had all this optimism in cannabis about we're going to legalize cannabis and free the prisoners, and there'll be so much opportunity and everybody will do well. And I'm really kind of a cannabis refugee. I helped write Amendment 64 in Colorado. So you're talking to one of 5 or 10 people that wrote cannabis and psychedelic legalization in Colorado in terms of the core group that were on both campaigns. And what I saw is that, boy, cannabis sure went south. And because I think we forget that we are a small community in a larger fishbowl of the dominant community, which is very focused on all the things that many of us struggle with, profit driven, top down, extractive economies. The culture of America, when I sit with indigenous people, I want to introduce myself and say, hi, I'm Sean McAllister. I grew up in the suburbs and watched cartoons and ate fast food. I mean, like, what is the culture that we're coming from? The culture is
Sure.
get rich quick and, be a baller and have all the top, everybody's a king and nobody does the work, I guess. And so where I'm going with that is, like, you can't take yourself out of this ocean that we're swimming in. And cannabis became this consolidated bastion of a few top players that are really crushing it. And some of them were legacy operators that figured out a way to navigate the dominant world. But, like, everything I see in cannabis is venture capital funds and public companies scooping up, legacy practitioners. And now it's just a widget. And the cannabis in Colorado is not very good. The regulated cannabis.
Oh yeah, we're a state that's really good at selling mids, I'll tell you that. But actually that's the whole point of commoditization, where I think the piece that I want to draw in about cannabis is that at least here in Colorado, for sure in California as well, is that when it first started, there was a lot of this, like, almost like cooperative mindset, meaning like there were series of growers who were then tied directly to caregivers who were then providing medicine directly to, let's say, that family in Texas whose kid has epilepsy and they need to travel out. So there was like a huge, I think, medicinal and medical focus. And then what we saw over time was that cannabis then started getting relegated more down to products, I think. And when there was that focus on products, it just became this commodity where nowadays, how most folks engage with cannabis is you go to your store, you get your gummies or your lozenges or maybe your pre-roll or your vape pen, and you go home and you rinse and repeat. And there is much less of an infusion on community, of culture, and things like that. And so thinking about how cannabis started and knowing that it had a lot of great intentions, this is kind of what I meant about that tool, or that cannabis became a tool which kind of like reinforced the same stuff. Like I share this story because I used to get involved with competitive licensure. I used to help folks like write applications to, get a license. And in Colorado, first I'll say there was no social justice or any of those initiatives in the first, 5 to 7 years of legal cannabis in Colorado. But I was in I forget whether this was the Illinois market or Ohio, where I was reading a cultivation application, and they had found a plot of land that was actually right adjacent to a county jail. And if you were, let's say, somebody who was incarcerated in that county jail, maybe, let's say, for a nonviolent drug offense, you're literally looking out the window at somebody legally cultivating cannabis while your freedoms are like stripped away. And so, I just use that as like a question to say that, psychedelics right now is very exciting. I think that it has this possibility of really revolutionizing holistic care, mental health, spiritual health, all of those things. And then I'm left to wonder, like, well, at what point does it just reinforce the systems that we're already in? And so, knowing that that happened with cannabis, I wonder if you have any like thoughts or insights on how we as a society, what things should we be paying attention to that would maybe help to safeguard against some of these things?
And that's where I was going with this background of cannabis. It's like, how is psychedelics going to be different? And I just want to bring us back to the cultural context, which is it is a long term project to build a culture that understands and respects plant medicine. And so, what I see and what worries me, not just the commodification of these medicines, because that is going to happen, the FDA approval process, there'll be prescription psychedelics that'll be very expensive. I think the MAPS MDMA protocol is like $40,000 at least and might not be covered by insurance for a lot of people. A lot of these psychedelic regulated contexts are going to cost thousands of dollars to go to Oregon or Colorado for a psilocybin journey. And so there will be commodification, but also just this worry that, I have a Apache friend in Arizona who says, and let's just not call it just about white people, but the problem with the dominant culture in America in general is that it just always wants something more. It's just never satisfied. It's kind of like you said, the worry about, is this just another bucket list experiential? People are consuming experiences, and whether they have to go to Peru or do it in the US, are they actually getting it? And my point about the intergenerational thing is, I'm teaching my kids about plant medicine. And unfortunately, part of why I'm in this movement is my kids have experienced some trauma as a result of a high conflict divorce with their mom and I. And their mother does suffer from diagnosed mental health conditions. And I'm not perfect and I made mistakes. But my point is, what does it look like in America 2-3 generations down the road when our community actually teaches its children to respect and appreciate and understand the indigenous background of these medicines, the spirituality of them, not just as a self-help tool, as a tool to actually connect with the divine, to reconcile the divinity within yourself. And so I think we're going to be let down in this current generation and currently and probably the next few. But I'm not giving up hope that an intergenerational struggle that extends out another 100, 200 years, the question is whether we will survive the next few hundred years as a globe to make any of this meaningful. But this is, people talk about psychedelics as counterculture. In South America and indigenous cultures, psychedelics are culture. They're not counterculture. They are rites of passage where at a certain point in your life, you go do these medicines, and we're not there yet. And so what worries me is that novice hybridized American practitioner who's been to Peru a few times and they think they're a shaman. What worries me is the medicalization of psychedelics that is turning the experience into something like a clinical trial with doctors and white coats and eye shades and playlists and non-nature buildings. That worries me. What worries me is like what's happened in California, that the politicians only seem interested in a regulated model. That's why Governor Newsom vetoed the decriminalization this year or last year in California. We have to have decriminalization along with a regulated model so that everybody has an option. If you want that medicalized thing, you can go regulate it. But culture is being built in this decriminalized world. And so a world of only clinical trials, only regulated model, that's a replication of cannabis.
Yeah.
That's what we don't want to see.
This is, you're bringing up a lot of potent things in your share there. And I'll highlight to our audience that a little bit of what you're speaking about with this intergenerational responsibility and legacy, maybe I'll say both of those words, does remind me of that like 7 generations principle in indigenous wisdom, which was first introduced to me by Sutton King, who we had an episode right around truths giving for that. And it's the idea that like are the actions that I'm taking, how is that going to impact society or my kin 7 generations, down the road? And what comes up for me is that folks are already, whether they know it or not, engaging with psychedelics in a very American way, meaning that it's very individual. Most of it is focused on like, how can I resolve my ailment, or how can I resolve my thing, and how can I resolve, and if here's the hidden conditionality of society, because society tells us if we're able to do that, then we're going to have the green light to go out into our communities and be better fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, community, folks, or better at business, or better at producing, or better. So you can see how there's like kind of this funny social fabric that's already, like built in here. And the other thing that really comes up for me in your share is that we're at this really crucial part of psychedelic. I think every part will be crucial. And I like what you said about like, we're probably going to be let down for a couple generations. I think that's a very sobering and real like take on what's going on, because I have been more low key talking about how there is this like almost secret war happening in psychedelics. And what I'll speak on that today is that if we don't understand history, and knowing that history is very subjective and written by the folks who have different opinions on how history has occurred, and if we have a very short-term memory with that, then there is this carte blanche for folks to rewrite the stories around psychedelics. And so, hearing what you were saying about, like, for some folks, psychedelics is just an experience that they get the proverbial award and get to tuck that on their shelf, or the badge that they get to sew onto their sash when they said, yep, I had a 5 gram psilocybin experience, and now I've experienced ego death, and like, look at me now, and what I think is missing from that is like, okay, so you've done that, so now what? Like, how do you show back up into society? Which I'm grateful when we're using this like cannabis psychedelic comparison and paradigm. In the cannabis world, nobody was even asking about that. Like, it was enough for somebody to get relief from chronic pain or epilepsy or whatever. We're like, yep, that's enough. Now psychedelics has built into it, I think, the raising of these like further questions. So I thought that was really insightful. I think some of what you were sharing already.
Yeah, so I want to, respond to that and just say there's so much going on here in terms of how are psychedelics going to evolve, and the issues around it. I think you're right that psychedelics are different than cannabis because they actually trigger some of the deepest meaning of who we are. Because psychedelics trigger a discussion about indigeneity and about why people are on this land and the legitimacy of this, occupation of indigenous land that Europeans and now people from all over the world have engaged in, the artificiality of the United States of America, the built on violence that it is. So there's so much going on here, but that's why it's a deeper struggle for us, is because it asks fundamental questions, and it asks questions about our relation to divinity, to Mother Earth, in a way that cannabis doesn't, And so this social justice issue is so much more out front. As you said about how it was rarely talked about early in cannabis, it is now the top topic that we're all talking about in psychedelics, and how to rebuild relationships with indigenous communities in a respectful way. People talking about reciprocity as a colonial concept of, is it reciprocity to pay indigenous people? Well, didn't we do that for Manhattan? That wasn't fair. Just paying them isn't what, the concepts of what's fair for indigenous people hasn't broken free from its colonial roots either. But I think, what's coming to mind is that I think all of us have a challenge to rethink how we're viewing this entire field. And so what I mean about that is I believe in a post-political world where it's not about right and left. It's about human beings. It's about quality of life, purpose-driven life. And so I think the progressive movement needs to drop the weapons when it comes to conservatives. And we need to learn the valuable lessons of conservatism, like individual liberty, like, conservatism means paying for your mess. I mean,
Mm.
there is wisdom there. And we get into these, even the wisdom of profit. I think we have to come to terms with, as a progressive community, with what profit means. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's what you do with profit. It's how you
Mhm.
make profit that's a bad thing, that can be a bad thing. And so these are just like broader psychological, spiritual challenges that are right now, we are circled up in the psychedelic community in a lot of ways. What you mentioned, this tension, and we are in a circle firing squad right now because we're one upping each other. Somebody's better than another. And it comes back to what you're talking about. We have to get out of this individual attainment mode and figure out a way to build community again, to have our laws reflect justice in some way, to reconcile who we are as spiritual beings with what the rules are in our laws. And that's what I do. That's what I told you earlier. It's like I'm the guy that's trying to translate medicine wisdom into the law and talk to old crusty judges that don't understand and have never had an experiential connection with divinity or a communal healing experience. And so for all those reasons, I just think, I mean, what more exciting time could there be? You are in the flow, you are in the mix of this conversation, everybody listening, and we need you to not disappear. We need you to engage, because it is a communal endeavor. And if you don't engage, we saw in Colorado, like, other people can step in, like Healing Advocacy Fund, and write our laws if there's not enough community engagement or involvement. And so you're not going to like those laws. If we have laws written by the elite, they're not going to include our community. So I just, a long rambling way of saying there's a
Sure.
lot going on there. I do want people to not give up hope and try to engage. We have a long way to go. We just started. We're at the beginning of the beginning with psychedelics.
Hmm. I really appreciate what you were saying about how psychedelics have this parallel to the human condition, which means that, like, well, what I mean by that is that when we engage with psychedelics, it inherently changes the way we view things, even if temporarily, even if you're just looking at the auditory, visual hallucinations or whatever. And I acknowledge that there's a lot of folks who come into psychedelics from a lot of different pathways, from a neurological process, from a mental health, aspect, from a personal growth aspect, from a spiritual aspect, from a scientific aspect. And even within all that, I think that one thing that psychedelics has the potential to do is to help us to think for ourselves, to ask questions, to challenge things, to listen, I think, regardless of whether you have a really hard experience or whether you have a really blissful and, joyful experience. And when in a conversation that I was having yesterday with a group of folks with the My Coalition, we were talking about some of these aspects, and what I posed was, well, are these issues of psychedelics, or are these larger issues of society, of which psychedelics kind of like bring up, for folks? So when you're talking about this being a time where you're talking to crusty judges and helping to convince them, thank you for doing that work, by the way. I'm sure that's a really big, heavy lift. And I think that those same conversations are relevant to anybody who is curious about psychedelics, because one of the downsides of this secret war, meaning like who decides how our society engages with psychedelics and what are the pathways in which that happens. That's what I mean about this secret war. And one of the things that I notice a sentiment of a lot of folks who I chat with is, well, folks are just sitting back and waiting for a process or a protocol or a regulated program or, a pathway like Psychedelic Passage. Like, folks are just kind of sitting back and being like, oh, well, somebody else will dictate to me how I should safely engage with psychedelics. And what I actually hear you saying is, no, you should ask the questions and figure out what's right for you. And I actually think that that's super powerful, because there is this inherent power dynamic. Like, I acknowledge when folks hear you and I talking, we're talking about psychedelic community and this is a collective and this is all that. I'm sure there are a ton of folks who be like, what are you talking about? Like, what
Yeah, right.
psychedelic community?
What
Like, what,
community? Yeah.
And I'm thinking about the 70-year-old grandma who isn't tapped into a community and something like that. And so this does speak a lot to the empowerment of individuals to be able to call the shots on how they want to engage with psychedelics. And I think that's so important because without folks even knowing, you're giving away a lot of your sovereignty and your autonomy and your power when it's just relegated to, this larger thing that we're chatting about. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I want to just celebrate Colorado for a second. Others are going to come along and do it better. But this is why I'm so proud of my home state is we have a decriminalized environment where you can grow, cultivate, share, possess for psychedelics. And then we have a regulated model coming. And it is the freest place in the world right now. And that is because the community, when we say that word, people always thank me for all the work I've done and that. But you know what? I couldn't take credit unless 54% of our community had voted in favor of that. And it's because of the dynamic you just said, which is this is a moment for psychedelics because the interest is higher than ever. No pun intended. The studies are supporting it. Old crusty people they have kids and grandkids who are addicted and have trauma issues and they're open to it. We're in an opiate epidemic. We're in a mental health crisis in America. What's that saying about a drum? The harder you hit it, the louder it makes sound. So maybe this is the drum beating back from psychedelics to our illness. But what really the goal is for all of us is to get beyond a place where we're in a sick culture, sick society, and we need psychedelics to be a soma to let us deal with the trauma of society. The goal is for healthy people to share psychedelics in a healthy way and have real community. And that's why I said it's an intergenerational process because we're probably not getting there in the next 10 years, but hopefully
Sure.
in our lifetimes, we can be moving towards that, not away from it. And we will not build a new world by destroying the old one. We will build the new world by building it, by building our own communities, by creating our own lifestyles that others want to model. So that's what we're doing. We are the minority in America right now. Again, as Ethan Nadelman says, you're not going to win as the super minority of 10% of America who uses psychedelics until those people who love psychedelics want change. And those people who hate psychedelics want change. And those people who don't care about what other people do with their bodies want change. That's when you have a movement. That's when you have a majority. And that means we have a job to talk to everybody we know about the healing potential and divinity and ancient traditions of psychedelics and the source of where they come from. And all these things are healthy, positive parts of life. And when we make that argument, we win. The economics is on our side. The morals are on our side. Right now, just the law is not on our side. So politicians are followers. When the culture changes, the law will change. So our job is cultural change.
Yeah, and I think a part of that is creating an environment where it's okay to scream out for change or to scream out for help or to, identify, hey, there's a real serious issue that potentially psychedelics can be something really meaningful towards, whether folks are looking at that from a mental health lens or they're looking at that from, we were talking about like social justice and a lot of different, areas. And as you were chatting about that, we can't build a society on a new society on the rubble of the old. You were also saying before, you were talking a little bit about, soil, and like I'm reminded of no-till methodology in growing cannabis, where like you have an old plant. That plant has already established its roots. And in those roots, there's the mycelial network. They're exchanging, sugars, they're exchanging nutrients and all of that. And the idea is that you don't go and you till all of that up. What you do is you take the existing structure, which is that mycelial network, and then you plant a new plant in there, and it uses that structure to flourish. And so I think that there's just a cool connection into the mycelial network and psilocybin and what you're doing. So yeah, Sean, I know that we could probably talk for much longer, and maybe we'll get you back on the show again, because I think what we're doing in this conversation is raising curiosity, raising questions. And so neither of us have the answers. And I want to really just thank our audience and thank you for being here in this really impassioned and engaging conversation. So I'd also like to just take a moment to read a testimonial and feedback from our community. We had somebody share, I have found your team and organization to be so well put together, thorough, and a place that people like myself can come to and trust when making a decision to move forward with a journey. That's really meaningful, honestly, because we are not individuals who pretend like we have it all figured out. I think one of the really important pieces for us is how do we listen to the needs of folks and help folks with a pathway to engage in psychedelics, hopefully in a more meaningful way, in a way with higher efficacy, in a way that can help folks build trust, along the internet. And so just thank you to that individual who put forward that little testimonial for us. Thank you to all of our staff and team. And, it's a real, it's just hitting my heart, in a really meaningful way when we get that type of feedback with folks, because none of this is perfect. I think most folks in the psychedelic space are just figuring it out as we go along. And, this is maybe an indicator that what we're doing is actually directly helping and supporting people. So thank you for that testimonial. That wraps it up for our episode today. Thanks to all of our listeners. You can find episodes of our podcast really anywhere you find podcasts: Apple Music, Spotify. We also post our episodes up on YouTube as well. So thank you all for being here. And thank you, Sean. And we look forward to seeing you all next week.
Thanks, Jeremy.